Everyone's got their favourite bad movie, some film that they love in spite of, or indeed because of, their bizarre, nonsensical, or badly executed elements, but I'm not sure the same can be said of video games. After all, video games can't really be as all-encompassing with poor artistic choices since, unlike film, the viewer isn't just a viewer, they're players, and no one wants to play a game that feels bad to control, you know? I would say that 2010's Deadly Premonition is about as close as games can get to being so bad they're good. It featured all these bizarre narrative choices, subpar audio-visual quality, and mechanical jank, but it still wasn't an unbearably awful experience to play. Don't get me wrong, it was not a game that you go to for satisfying gameplay, but it was functional at the very least, and the rest of the game was a wild enough ride to make it worthwhile. Deadly Premonition 2, A Blessing in Disguise, is in much the same boat as the original, but while some new mechanics and tweaks serve to streamline and improve the first game's more frustrating elements, it suffers from more pervasive technical issues which ultimately make it less endearing and more annoying than its predecessor. Much like its predecessor, the majority of Deadly Premonition 2 follows Agent Francis York Morgan as he investigates a bizarre murder in a rural town, this time in Le Carre, Louisiana. Unlike the first game, however, the bulk of the story is actually a flashback, framed by a now retired Agent Morgan recounting the events to FBI agent Aaliyah Davis during an interrogation. This prequel-sequel format gives the game a lot of opportunities to set up plot elements and play with players' expectations, though at the end of the day the plot itself isn't doing anything particularly special. It's an entertaining time, and seeing how the past and present stories collide is satisfying enough, but Deadly Premonition 2's true strength lies in its goofy characters and the unpredictable tangents that the writing goes on. Agent York remains a lovable jerk who is fascinated by the mundane yet unfazed by the supernatural, and his ramblings on film, culture, and philosophy are as entertaining and baffling as they ever were in the first game. This goofy and offbeat writing is still easily the best part of the game to me, though it is worth pointing out that there are a handful of occasions where it just comes off as awkward and insensitive, particularly with regards to the game's only trans character. I do feel like it's necessary to point out that the developer has apologized for these elements since the game's release, going so far as to say that they will be modified to better match his intent as soon as possible, but I can only review the game that I have, and as of time of writing, these aspects of the story are still really jarring. Thankfully, these jarring elements are not the majority of what Deadly Premonition 2 has to offer. In addition to a ridiculous story that fleshes out the already wild world of Agent York, the game offers up an entire town full of weird and wonderful inhabitants. Overall, I think the game has a much more memorable cast than its predecessor, at the cost of the first game's subtlety, I guess? Where the first game had an entire town filled with characters that were just a little bit quirky, Deadly Premonition 2 turns that wackiness up to 11 almost as soon as your time in Le Carre begins. I guess what I'm trying to say is that Deadly Premonition 2 is more overtly weird, where the first game had this really uncanny quality to it. This isn't a bad thing necessarily, but the change in tone is certainly noteworthy. That change in tone is also emphasized by the game's new visual style. Unlike Deadly Premonition 1's flat, washed-out colors, Le Carre is bright and vibrant, and the game's character models stand out a bit more thanks to some light cell shading. Do the models and environments actually look better? Yeah, kinda. The game now runs at 810p rather than 720p, which is something, but on the flip side, the game's frame rate is absolute trash. At the best of times, Deadly Premonition 2 runs at about 22 FPS, but out in the open world of Le Carre, that sits at closer to 15 FPS, and thanks to memory leaks, that only gets worse the longer you play the game. This frame rate issue is the big deal breaker of Deadly Premonition 2, I think, just because it's so pervasive, but I also think it could be worse. It runs like trash, but at least it consistently runs like trash, rather than fluctuating wildly all the time, you know? At least the game's audio is definitely much less distracting this time around, as the absurd mixing of the previous game has been replaced with music, sound effects, and dialogue that actually sound appropriate, with one exception. This does mean that a little bit of the original's broken-as-hell charm is lost here, but the odd personality of the franchise remains thanks to a vast and varied assortment of music, as well as the over-the-top hammy voice work across all of Deadly Premonition 2's characters. The one area of Deadly Premonition 2's sound design that really stood out to me, though, was the skateboarding. More specifically, how the rumbling of York's skateboard rolling down the streets drowns out almost everything else because, unlike the rest of the audio this time around, someone forgot to mix this one thing properly. Also, York has a skateboard now, I guess. Unlike Deadly Premonition 1, you're unable to drive cars in Le Carre, instead having to rely on a skateboard to get around town quickly, and surprisingly, it's a far more responsive and functional experience. The unexpected improvements made to traveling the open world are helped along by the game having a much smaller but more densely packed world, as well as a map screen that doesn't rotate whenever the hell it feels like it. Sure, you're probably gonna go deaf listening to the constant skateboarding, but I will take this over piloting Deadly Premonition 1's cars any day of the week. Besides, you can eventually do sick tricks, which makes Deadly Premonition 2 way dumber, and thus way more enjoyable. But if skateboarding and destroying your ears doesn't sound ideal, then I guess there's also fast travel, which is way easier to gain access to this time around. Honestly, there's a lot about Deadly Premonition 2 that feels more immediately playable than its predecessor. For instance, York no longer uses pseudo-tank controls to move, and you can move while aiming now, which is nice. Additionally, while fighting monstrous enemies in the other world, you gain access to a charge shot which locks onto them, which basically negates any sense of difficulty that the game might pose. Because really, who is playing Deadly Premonition 2 to challenge themselves? Not me. The gameplay here is the price that you pay to experience the story, the characters, and the overall strangeness, and to be honest, this plays fine, so I'm happy to pay that price. But being fine still doesn't mean it's particularly fun, and the game's inaccurate shooting and backwards inventory system hamstring the more active gameplay elements more than a little. For starters, your aiming reticle is a massive circle, which makes precision aiming an uncertain affair. It's not a huge issue since enemies can't take much punishment, and I was somehow able to make precision shots by accident anyway. No, more frustrating is Deadly Premonition 2's inventory management, which has taken a step back since the previous game. Where Deadly Premonition 1 would let you send items to the toolbox storage when you pick them up, DP2 simply doesn't. This wouldn't be a huge issue, but your inventory space is limited, and if you have open slots, the game autofills them as you grab stuff off the floor. This means that as you empty your inventory of bullets and pick up the cold and flu medicine that enemies drop for some reason, you're likely to find yourself in the middle of a fight with no bullets. The game is still playable at this point, but York's melee capabilities are, if I'm being generous, dog shit. Now, was punching and kicking the game's penultimate boss to death a suitably dumb way to bring Deadly Premonition 2 to a close? Yes. Was it also a massive pain in the ass? Also yes. I think the developers must know that folks are coming to this game for everything but the gameplay, since the survival horror shooter sections in the other world are few and far between. The actual majority of Deadly Premonition 2 is spent completing fetch quests for the citizens of Le Carré, and with the help of York's skateboard, these genuinely feel like way less of a chore than the previous game. Probably my biggest complaint regarding Deadly Premonition 2's reliance on fetch quests is that the game doesn't have enough bizarre monologues for York to go on to keep the travel time interesting. In the first game, it felt like each new car trip would result in some fascinating or stupid conversation between York and his best friend Zack, but Deadly Premonition 2 just cycles between the same small handful of conversations until you progress far enough to unlock more. And even then, the game still loops back around to some of its earliest discussions. Granted, you can make York chat with his preteen assistant and the best new character, Patty, but even these interactions are severely limited. I also felt way less inclined to do the game's side content despite the improvements made to overworld exploration, thanks to the severely scaled back nature of Deadly Premonition 2's upgrades and unlockables. Unlike the first game, you're unable to purchase different guns or vehicles, meaning you're stuck with a pistol and a skateboard for the game's duration, and though you can customize the properties of both of these items, such as the gun's fire rate or ammo type, or the skateboard's speed and handling, it lacks the silliness and satisfaction that comes with buying a sports car that's too fast to be useful, or unlocking an infinite ammo machine gun. On top of that, the upgrade system itself relies on farming materials from animals in the open world and monsters from the other world, and although I'm willing to put up with a little bit of grind to experience this franchise's silliness, running around and killing squirrels and gators for an hour is a bit much, even for me. I mean, I guess if you're really desperate to get as much out of this game as possible, you could spend your time skipping rocks or bowling or partaking in any of the other minigames, but why would you bother? Admittedly, these parts of the game are just as functional as any other element, but they're really only worth doing to progress the story. And with that, Deadly Premonition 2, A Blessing in Disguise, is bad? I mean, on a technical level, it is bad. It's a current-gen game in the year 2020 which runs at 810p and barely hits 20 frames per second when it's performing at its peak. But I would be lying if I said that Deadly Premonition 2 doesn't capture that same charm that made the first one a cult classic, and in terms of gameplay, it even manages to streamline and improve some elements without losing the zaniness. At the end of the day, I don't regret spending 20-something hours with this game, and while it definitely hits a little differently to the original Deadly Premonition, I think fans of that game will find something to enjoy here, as long as their eyes can withstand the horror that is the frame rate. Ultimately, though, I'm not sure I can recommend this to newcomers. Deadly Premonition 2, A Blessing in Disguise is available on the Nintendo Switch, despite looking like it was made for the GameCube.